I'm David. I came up as an actor, I work in higher ed, and I run a small theater company, but what I really love to do is direct. And when I'm directing, I try to listen more than I speak. The challenge today is that this is a pre-recorded virtual workshop, and if I spend the next half hour listening, you're going to have a pretty weird video. So today, for about the next 30 or 40 minutes, I'm going to share some thoughts with you. Along the way, there'll be some small exercises. You should feel free, if you're able, to pause the video and move at your own pace. Okay? Let's get cooking. If you direct for the theater, you might have learned a lot about your craft the same way that I did, which is working with a bunch of different directors and taking note of those things that seemed to work well and recognizing some choices that didn't. And I really hope you have had that experience of working with that brilliant director who didn't necessarily have all the answers, but definitely had the calm and the cool and the confidence to trust that their collaborators together would make some great discoveries. You've also probably had the experience of working with that other director, the one who tells you how to move, or how to feel, or most egregiously, how to say the words that have been written down for you. Or maybe you've worked with a director who's full of passion, but doesn't always have the language to translate that in a way that is useful or actionable by the team. Or maybe you've worked with a director who is so desperate to achieve a singular vision that they lose sight of what's really important. We've all known that other director. Sometimes we've been that other director. And I'm of the belief that something separating that other director from that brilliant director is the ability to communicate in multiple figurative languages. Years ago, I worked on a show where an actor was cast to play a robot that slowly became more human over time. And I noticed that when the director communicated with this actor, it was almost exclusively in the language of Le Bon movement analysis and Edith Skinner's phonetics, but when they spoke to me, they seemed almost intuitively to know that I'd come from a different background. And something that I noticed was that this really sharp director had a different way of communicating with every single member of the company that seemed perfectly attuned to how that person needed to work. Around that same time, I worked on another production that was different. This director announced at our first meeting that we'd spend the next few weeks doing some viewpoints-based exercises. Now, I didn't have a lot of experience with viewpoints at the time, and I thought, hey, that's great. I'm going to learn something new. I'm going to have a whole lot of fun. And I did. But then we got into staging, and it became painfully apparent that this director had run out of language to communicate with their team. This led to a lot of frustration when we failed to deliver on what the director was hoping for, and it would ultimately culminate in the director just pointing around the stage and saying, go there, say the line like this. Not a lot of fun. There was also the director who wanted the scene to have a certain sense of joy, and they knew that I had grown up in Southern California, and I used to love going to Disneyland, and they said, just pretend you're at Disneyland. What they didn't know is that I'd recently been dumped at Disneyland, and the scene was not infused with any sense of joy. Or there was the director who said very deliberately, you just need to be more bag dragging. I don't have any idea what that means. Each of these instances, you had a director who'd run out of language to communicate with their team. But if a director's toolkit includes multiple ways of communicating, that director opens up avenues of discourse. And along the way, you can replace some less helpful ways of working with tools that just might do the trick. So today, we'll look at how directors can better collaborate with their actors by communicating subtext, engendering trust, focusing on action, approaching with curiosity, and remembering kindness. These are all simple tools that you can use at your next rehearsal and stack your toolkit. Let's talk about subtext. There might be no more influential concept to the contemporary theater, and most certainly American realism, than subtext. And even if you have never read An Actor Prepares, I'm willing to bet you have some understanding of subtext. Think about the cliche of the school bully who says, "Oh, it's good to see you today." Or the person with a crush who goes, "Oh, it's good to see you today." One of those means I'm going to kick your butt, and the other means I'm in love with you. If the text is the text, then subtext is the meaning that lives underneath. I love Dominic Finocchiaro's essay, The Problem with the Argument Against Subtext, in which he writes, subtext is all the things that can't be defined by words. Subtext is the ghost note. It's the reverberations at the center of the earth, the space between words, the ink, but not what the ink comes to represent. Subtext is where the id gets a say, where feelings really do matter more than facts. And in that emotional territory is where we find true commonality. In the words of Hope Azeda, pain is pain, laughter is laughter, emotions are where we really meet as humans. And subtext works best when it is direct, when it is visceral, when it comes from the heart. It is the truest truth, so true that we dare not say it out loud. So how, as a director, can you use this? We all know that the biggest no-no is to give an actor a line reading, right? To tell an actor how to say the words that have been written down for them. It robs the actor of creativity, it puts the actor in their own head, it puts the actor in a place of trying to emulate or please the director, and at best, it leads to something hollow, and at worst, it leads to confusion or frustration or resentment. But you can always make an offering of subtext. If there's a scene, and in the middle of the scene, there's an argument, and the character says, "Give me the keys to the car," instead of saying, "Hey, say the line like this," or saying, "Can you just be really angry?" Why not make an offering of subtext? Can that line mean, "I can't wait to get out of here," or "I hate living here," or "I hate you," or something really simple like, "Shut up!" Subtext works best when it's direct, when it's simple. If it becomes at all lengthy in nature, it will inevitably become cerebral. Sometimes there's value in having an actor interject their subtext before or after their scripted lines. It doesn't want to stay in rehearsal long enough to become part of the actor's muscle memory, and it works best if it's brief. But sometimes that quick jolt of emotional truth can unpack a moment. You're working on a scene where a character is professing their undying love. You might experiment with having that actor say, "I love you," before or after each of their lines. It might yield some interesting discoveries. It's a great exercise, and one that tends to reveal fascinating discoveries and interesting choices. Let's give this a try. You are directing a spooky thriller, and one of the characters is supposed to say, "It's so dark in here." The character is clearly frightened, but you don't want to give a line reading. So instead, what are some offerings of subtext that you might propose? What did you come up with? Was it something like, "I'm scared," or "My heart is racing," or "Hold me," or "I want my mommy"? Maybe it was something really simple like, "No!" Or maybe you interjected something before or after the line, like, "I'm scared, it's so dark in here, I'm scared." Whatever you came up with, if it was your own, creative, and emotionally true, I bet it was fabulous. Now, a caveat, this particular tool won't work with all material. In fact, it runs the risk of obscuring or subverting meaning and understanding. Be cautious if you're working on a text written prior to about 1850, or of the global majority, or that is at all non-realistic or abstract in nature. Not all material comports with Stanislavski's theories of acting, and you may have some content that predates or challenges or subverts that writing. But in rehearsal, there's no harm in playing. Who knows what you might find? Stanislavski once wrote, "Spectators come to the theater to hear the subtext. They can read the text at home." There are lots of ways to engender trust. One is by establishing commonality. And a way of doing that is by sharing stories. Your story. If you have a story from your personal lived experience that speaks perhaps to the scene or the needs of the character, you might consider revealing that. You might consider sharing that part of you. There's a line that the character of Molly speaks in the play Peter and the Starcatcher that I love. And she says, "Things are only worth what you're willing to give up for them." Well, what is your story worth? What would it cost you to tell that story? Some of your mystique? Some of your hierarchical power? Some of your comfort? Those are the stories that are worth telling. They humanize directors. And they help forge those bonds of trust. We ask actors to be brave all the time. And I think directors need to be brave too. My first job as an equity actor was an adaptation of The Red Badge of Courage. If you've never read the novel, it's a story about a young soldier in the American Civil War. We were working on this production in the months that led up to the US-led invasion of Iraq. And our director, who was a veteran, wanted very deliberately to make a piece of theater that asked us not to romanticize war, that reminded us that the decision to go to war should never be taken lightly. But if I am perfectly honest, we found the battle scenes in the show really thrilling. There was hand-to-hand combat, and there were pyrotechnics, and it was really easy to forget that you were working on a sober drama and instead feel like, you were John Wick. And so one night, our director shared with us a story about his time in Vietnam. And I have never forgotten how I felt when he trusted us with that story. And it was impossible for that feeling to not inform the work that we were doing on the show. Your actors will trust you when they see you, and they will want to honor the emotional investment that you bring to the story. And this tool, by the way, replaces some approaches that are otherwise problematic or even dangerous. Remember the story about the director who told me to just think about Disneyland? Well, there are some problems when a director offers up a collaborator's personal experiences for everybody's creative fodder. First of all, it's nobody's business. Personal lives are personal. That stuff is no one's business. It's not a good idea for a director to make assumptions about what aspects of a person's private life are safe or even useful. Private lives are private, and they are meant to be protected. A person's real-world experiences, those are precious, and the individual, and only the individual, should choose what they wish to share and what they wish to keep private. And if someone is asked to play with something delicate, they will understandably be less likely to take risks and create with abandon. Imagine a director with a very specific idea about the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, and this well-intentioned director says to an actor, "I just want you to think about your first kiss." The director has made the assumption that the actor has had this experience, and that they want to think about this experience, but the director's also made the bold assumption that this experience will have any applicability or bearing on what the director hopes to get out of the scene. Look, I don't know about you, but my first kiss, it was weird and it was gross. It was weird, it was gross. That's it. And unless you want that to be in your balcony scene, I am better served by using my own imagination, which you can always attempt to stimulate by sharing your story. And the imagination, the imaginary world, is always more fertile than anything that a person can have actually experienced. That's a bold statement, but think about it. There's no real-world occurrence that can't be amplified by the imagination. You want to feel shame and embarrassment in a scene. Maybe you think about the time that you were on stage and your pants fell down. Okay, that didn't happen to you, but it did happen to me. So I could think about that, or I can imagine the time that my pants fell down on television and my grandmother was in the studio and my grandmother was watching. It happened in front of my grandmother, everybody. It happened in front of my grandmother. Oh, God, that's awful. How great is that? How much better is that? Two notes about sharing stories to engender trust. One, you do need to be respectful of and cognizant of your collaborators' boundaries. You do not want to become the TMI director. And at the same time, your stories need to bring you to emotional life. They need to come from the heart. I am reminded of the poet Anais Nin, who wrote, "The personal, if it is deep enough, becomes universal, mythical, symbolic." Let's focus now on action. August Wilson said, "I believe in the American theater's power to inform about the human condition, its power to heal." And we all recognize that emotion, that passion, is part of the human condition, part of what we crave in a night out at the theater. And yet, we must never forget what it is that actors really do. While discussing subtext and trust, I've alluded to the importance of emotion. And yet, actors never go on stage to feel. They go on stage to do. They go on stage to act, to perform actions. I mean, it's right there in the word. Actor, A-C-T, act. Act as in action. Actors perform actions. It would be an easy thing to keep at the forefront of your mind, you'd think. And yet, how often do we find ourselves speaking to actors describing the scene in the context of feelings or emotions or, adjectives? How do we turn this bad habit around and offer direction that is more useful? By focusing on action and trusting that with the correct action, the right tactic, the most specific objective, emotion will follow. The actor does not need to be sad. Maybe, though, they could grieve or mourn or reminisce. The actor does not need to be sexier. They might seduce, they might flirt, they might command. The actor does not need to be more intense, though they could threaten, they could press, they could squeeze. And this is the reason we have rehearsal. We try out each action with its subtle, distinct aromas and flavors. I like to cook, and I have never in my life heard anyone say, "This needs herbs." No, because there's a difference between thyme and oregano and dill, cilantro if, you're into that sort of thing. What flavor of action does your scene need? Because action is a vehicle for intention. Kay Jenny Jones is a really smart teacher and director who I first worked with as a combat choreographer, and she would say, "Your true intention always reads." Meaning, if I'm supposed to throw a punch that you are going to duck, and my intention is to have exquisite form as I perform my flawlessly executed punch for the stage, that is what an audience is going to read. But if my intention is to scare you, or to de-escalate the fight, or to impress somebody who's watching, that will read. And it just happens to be that I am performing a flawlessly executed punch. Your true intention is what reads. Action is everything. So let's give this one a try. Imagine an emotion or an adjective that might describe a character's state of being in a scene. Perhaps you will use one of these listed here. Rather than offering an emotion or an adjective or a state of being, what action might you suggest to your actor? Maybe instead of sadness, your actor will grieve or mourn or reminisce. Maybe instead of happiness, you could invite the actor to revel, to dance, to indulge. Instead of being dangerous, you might encourage the actor to play, or taunt, or attack. You might notice that some of these actions, these verbs, are rather physical in nature, and that is in no way an invitation for your actors to do physical harm to one another. Any verb, any action, any tactic, any intention can be played with any part of the body from any distance or with any word. I can tickle you with my eyes, or I can slap you with my line. Action defines character, and I try to be in the habit of thinking of a play in terms of its action. After all, according to Aristotle, we are the sum of our actions, and therefore our habits make all the difference. Curiosity. They say it killed the cat, but I've owned a cat, and I don't know what these people are talking about, though I am curious to know. Curiosity is an essential quality of the artist. We explore, we discover, we venture into the unknown, we reject the status quo. Toni Morrison said, "All good art is political. There is none that isn't. And the ones that try hard not to be political are political by saying we love the status quo." And who loves the status quo? The status quo is a known quantity, and you don't spend $200 on a mezzanine seat to get the known quantity. No. No, I want the unknown. And can we consider then that the director's job could be to lead collaborators into the unknown, but with some sense of destination? How do we do that? Could we turn then to the great philosopher Ted Lasso, who was correct in stating, though wrong in his attribution, be curious, not judgmental. Can we take this advice to heart? Can we wonder more? Can we operate from a place of curiosity? I mean, I'm curious what would happen if, as directors, we attempted to communicate only in questions, if we were to attempt to lead by way of curiosity. I'm curious, what are your feelings? Could we do that? Could we direct only by inquiring? I mean, it's what we've been doing ever since the Toni Morrison quote. Questions that empower an actor to share their thoughts, their feelings, their contributions, those are great. And questions that come from a genuine place of curiosity. Questions that don't assume an answer, but rather are invested in the experiment. Those can crack a scene wide open. I once struggled with a monologue near the end of a play. The character had this really lovely, melancholy speech about the end of his entire family. And I just couldn't crack it. And I was trying absolutely everything. What I was doing is I was doing too much. But I had this really great director. He was very, very smart. And what he did not say was, just stand there, do less. He could have said that. But instead he said, it's our dinner break. When we come back tonight, I wonder what would happen if you just stood there. Stand there communicates that the director has the key and they know what is waiting behind the door. And it puts the actor in a place of taking their focus off of the scene, and it makes the actor conscious of their performance as they anticipate whatever will be revelatory. It puts the actor in a place of wanting to please the director, and it robs the actor of making a discovery in that moment. But posing that direction as a question, I wonder what would happen if you stood there. Could we try that? That allows for the answer to be found in the investigation of the moment itself. And who wouldn't rather investigate and play than have the answer given to them? That was a good piece of direction, and we found the scene. Now, not all questions are created equally. Be very cautious of closed-ended questions, anything that can be answered with a pat yes or no. These don't engender a sense of discovery, and they can inadvertently suggest that the director might think there's a right or a wrong answer. You also want to avoid questions about what a character would or would not do. Characters exist as ideas on paper until an actor brings them to life by way of action. Meaning, a character can do, would do, will do just about anything that you can discover in the rehearsal hall on your feet. Would your character do this? That's just not going to yield the same interesting results and possible choices that can come from, I'm curious about X. How would you feel about trying X? That last question, how would you feel about X, can be particularly useful. And in this, I am indebted to Chelsea Pace and Laura Reichert of Theatrical Intimacy Education, whose work goes a long way towards empowering actors and creating spaces where theater makers can be brave. Brave to use their voices and assert their feelings, but also brave to take big risks. If you have the opportunity to take a workshop with TIE, do it. How would you feel about gives the actors space to share their thoughts, their feelings, their curiosity about the possibilities, as well as their reservations or their boundaries. Go stand on that table is dictatorial, and nobody likes a dictator. Could you go stand on that table is better, though anytime you ask a question, you should be open to the answer, and if the answer is no, now you have to abandon that possibility, or, beg, and nobody likes people who beg. Don't beg. But I wonder what happens if you stand on that table. How would you feel about trying that? That leaves the best possible space. The space for exploration, the space for discovery, the space for curiosity instead of judgment, and the space to find some really interesting impulses that just might transform your show. And those are the kinds of impulses that we want, right? I love Jack Nicholson, and he once said, if you get an impulse in a scene, no matter how wrong it seems, follow the impulse. It might be something, and if it ain't, take two. So, here's your chance. Here are some simple pieces of direction. How could you, as a most helpful director, reframe this language to empower curiosity? What did you come up with? Maybe instead of, I need you to condemn her, you would say something like, I'm curious what happens if you condemn her. Or instead of, move behind the piano, you could try, I'm curious what happens if you try hiding behind the piano. How would you feel about that? Notice too, hiding, much better action than move. So much richer, so much more interesting. It's the oregano of actions. Next time you need to offer a piece of direction. I'm curious what happens if you direct only in questions. Could you try that? I wonder what would happen. How would you feel about that? I'm curious. Kindness. This one is less a tool and more a gentle reminder that the way in which we communicate, the way that we treat people, it really matters. And everyone in the theater got into the game because it was fun. It made us feel good. When I was in undergrad, our department was recruiting a new acting teacher. And they brought a candidate to campus who had the opportunity to teach a sample class. A friend of mine worked with the candidate on a Hotspur monologue from Henry IV, Part 1. And the candidate felt that the speech needed a certain degree of a warrior's passion. So he told the actor to stand at attention like he was in basic training, and then the candidate stood right next to his ear and yelled and screamed at him during the speech as though he was some kind of drill instructor. Now, the actor had a response. The actor became red-faced and became very emotional and stomped and fretted, and oh boy, was I impressed by the work that my friend was doing. And later, I was talking to another professor, and I said, that was really incredible, the results that that tactic brought out of that actor. And the professor said, yeah, well, what? The candidate is supposed to go on stage with the actor every time he does Henry IV and yell in his ear? Now, I pushed back. I said, well, look what was achieved. And I'll never forget, that professor looked at me and said, yeah, at what cost? There are stories, especially in film, of directors who have bullied performances out of actors. And I have come to the conclusion that every single one of those directors was operating from a place of fear. Fear that there wasn't enough time. Fear that they would be unable to deliver on a product. Fear that the process was not going to yield the results that the director desired. Fear that kindness was a luxury. That kindness was in the way. And it's fueled by a belief that actors are machines and that abuse is just part of the business. And I'm here to tell you, unkindness has never once served a play, period. Period. There's just no reason to be unkind. Everything can be done with kindness. I've had to fire people, but I've done even that kindly. Two books that I highly recommend are James P. Carse's Finite and Infinite Games and The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. Both of these books have at their core a simple but powerful theory. Our lives are made up of games. Some of those games, kind of like chess or Uno, they have an ending. The game of, will I wake up on time? The game of, will I remember to put gas in the car? The game of, which one of us is going to pay for lunch? These are finite games because they have an ending and they have a goal that you either achieve or you don't, and there is usually a winner or a loser, and the goal is to be the winner. But there's another type of game, the infinite game. And the purpose of the infinite game is to keep playing the game. If you want to go to the zoo and I want to go to a concert, I could think of that as a finite game where I win and get my way, or I can think of that as an infinite game, where the purpose of the game is to maintain our relationship so that we can keep playing the game. And this simple construct of game theory can inform everything that we do as directors and how we communicate with our collaborators and our actors. The purpose of the game should not be to get the show up. The purpose of the game should not be to achieve some sense of my vision. No, the purpose of the game should be to make sure that we get to keep playing the game. To make sure that we get to keep telling stories and making theater. To make this an infinite game. Lee Strasberg said something that I absolutely love. He said, "Don't be concerned with being right. You can win the argument and lose the actor, and that's not good." There are a number of books that I think are helpful for directors to consider, and they're not all found in the arts section at Barnes & Noble. I highly recommend Colin Powell's second memoir, It Worked for Me, in which the former Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs outlines 13 rules of leadership. And you might be surprised to find that at their core, at least 3 are about this really simple concept. Kindness matters. Rule 1, it ain't as bad as you think. It will look better in the morning. Rule 10, remain calm, be kind. And my favorite, Rule 13, perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. Breathe. Remember, your team is your team. In the world of directing, we are always allocating resources. So remember, the great thing about kindness, it's free. All right, we are nearing our end and we have covered 5 simple ideas. The value of subtext, a mechanism to build trust, a focus on action, an embrace of curiosity, and a gentle nudge to remember kindness. These are 5 tools for your toolkit. 5 ways of expanding and enhancing the language you use when communicating with actors. And remember, as many spoken languages as there are in the world, there are at least 7.5 billion additional ways of communicating, because that's how many people are on this planet. And each of us thinks and dreams and creates in our own unique way. There are a number of resources you can turn to as you continue to expand your toolkit. At the end of this video, I'll include a list of texts that I have found invaluable, but it's never about any one way, but rather stacking your approaches. So before we end, let's stack our toolkit, because here's the thing, all 5 of these mechanisms can operate together. It's like the Avengers of theater making. One last hypothetical. You are directing a romantic comedy, and this is the meet-cute scene. The pivotal moment, let's say the line of dialogue is, "Let's get some pizza." It's not working. It doesn't feel right. How might you communicate with the actor so as to combine all 5 of these tools? What'd you come up with? Maybe it's something like, I wonder what happens in that moment when you say, "Want to get some pizza," if what that really means is, "I love you." You know, sometimes my son will wake me up early in the morning on the weekend to play video games, and I always say yes. And not because I want to play any particular game, I just want to spend every moment I can with my son. He says, "Do you want to play video games?" And I say yes, but it really means I love you. I'm curious to see what happens if we use that line and you allow yourself to risk opening up your heart. How would you feel about trying that? Look, at the end of the day, there's no one road to Rome, and there's no right way to eat a Reese's. But if you stack your director's toolkit, and if you listen, I think you're going to be just fine. I want to thank you for listening. Have great rehearsals. Be brilliant.